All right, we are going to get started. It's 12:32 on my clock, and I don't want to delay this conversation any longer. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lorez Wilson. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I proudly serve as an impact director with City Year Columbus. Today, we commemorate the legacy and vision of Martin Luther King Jr. by presenting our second installment of City Year Columbus's series, Advancing Racial Equity Beyond 2020. Today's discussion is titled Why Representation Matters. And our conversation will feature a robust panel, and I mean robust, panel of English language arts professionals to discuss the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and representation in literacy. As hosts of this event, City Year Columbus would like to thank our sponsors, moderator, panelists, and all of you, everyone in attendance. We are excited for this opportunity to convene a space to discuss the intersection of race, equity, social justice, and representation in the English language arts space. This will be a dynamic, hearty, and informative discussion that we hope will lead to many more. I also would like to thank the following sponsors for supporting this event: Huntington Bank, CODA, or Central Ohio Transit Authority, Deloitte, Alliance Data, Buckeye Interactive, and the Robert Weiler Company. Additionally, we would like to recognize our school's service partner, Columbus City Schools, and our AmeriCorps partner, Serve Ohio. I am also excited to announce the recipient of the 2022 City Year Ripple Award. City Year Columbus is honored to present the Columbus Foundation with the 2022 City Year Columbus Ripple Award in recognition of their extraordinary commitment to students, service, and the Columbus community. The Columbus Foundation has been a dedicated supporter of City Year Columbus and contributor to the Whole School, Whole Child program, supporting over 4,400 students in Columbus City Schools. Additionally, the Columbus Foundation provided critical support necessary for City Year to facilitate its work as we navigated the COVID-19 pandemic. City Year Columbus has also been a multi-year recipient of the Columbus Foundation Summer Fellowship Program. Please join me in congratulating the 2022 City Year Columbus Ripple Award winner, the Columbus Foundation. All right, so before we meet our panelists and dive into our discussion, I would like to introduce Ela Robinson, Executive Director for City Year Columbus, to welcome everyone and share a few thoughts about this afternoon's discussion. Ela, take it away.
Thanks, Rez. Today's discussion is the second installment of our Advancing Racial Equity series. This series is designed to facilitate key conversations in the area of educational and racial equity and to explore its impact on students, stakeholders, supporters, and the larger community. So I would like to welcome and thank everyone in attendance for today's panel, including representatives from our national City Year team, staff, board members, and also AmeriCorps members from our other City Year sites, including City Year Tulsa, Memphis, Cleveland, Little Rock, and Philadelphia. I'd also like to welcome attendees from the Columbus community, including our partners, champions, nonprofits, the Columbus Foundation, representatives from Columbus City Schools, and other supporters of City Year Columbus. So please be on the lookout for future conversations as we continue to dive deep into key issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next, I'd like to pass it off to Victoria Branch to get the conversation started.
Thank you, Adero. Good afternoon. My name is Victoria Branch. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I proudly serve as a first-year AmeriCorps member with City Year Columbus, serving at Champion Middle School. I am working in a 7th grade ELA classroom. Upon reflecting on my own relationship with literature and my why for service with City Year, I'm constantly brought back to the idea of empowerment. I had the opportunity to share with my Columbus Corps members that I value representation, specifically in children's literature, for the opportunity it creates to provide youth with examples of heroes and problem solvers that look like them. It makes those big dreams our students have seem more tangible, and it has the potential to help students imagine themselves in ways they've otherwise never thought to. What I value the most about my service with City Year is the opportunity to be a part of an empowering force for our students, not only challenging growth, but being a part of a larger effort to reveal to them just how expansive their potential really is. In the same way that a book centering a young Black scientist may inspire the next generation of exceptional Black chemists, as a City Year, I'm able to act as a bridge to exposure to endless possibilities. That honestly being one of the main reasons I wear this red jacket with pride. Before I introduce our moderator and panelists, I'd like to ground us in our values of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. City Year was founded with a core belief that uniting and empowering diverse teams of idealistic young people and charging them with addressing some of our country's most difficult challenges can change the world for the better. The organizational values we collectively uphold are deeply rooted in this belief and in our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, also known as DEIB. Our journey to fully live our values and our commitment to DEIB is ongoing, but with each step forward, we come closer to actualizing our mission and fulfilling our promises to one another. Next, I'd like to introduce the moderator and panelists for today's discussion. John Jackson is the Assistant Vice President of Mergers and Acquisitions with Nationwide Insurance. John also serves as a City Year Columbus board member. Joining us for the panel, Dion Custer-Edwards, Director of Learning and Public Practice at the Weckner Center for the Arts, Izetta Thomas, Early Childhood Behavior Specialist for Columbus City Schools, and Dr. Sydney Jones, Instructional Coach, also with Columbus City Schools. Looking forward to this panel.
And thank you, Victoria. And before we get started, let's go ahead and really break down some key points to consider as we're about to take on this really important conversation today. And the first one is that the space that we're in, this virtual space, it's for genuine conversation, it's for genuine inquiry, and we want to make sure that we're being vulnerable and honest as we're having this important conversation. The second one is this is a space to be brave, where we're open to sharing ideas, we're going to challenge each other, and potentially face discomfort as people may have alternative viewpoints. And then the last one is probably one of the most important, is that we want to make sure that we are given a space to encourage each of you who are listening today, that are community members, that are doing service in your own way, that we want to encourage you to go ahead and pose questions in the chat. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the conversation. And I'm going to start first with you, Ms. Dion. Can you bring us up to speed in terms of what actually is language?
You know, I think that as I'm thinking about language and thinking about what it is, I think one way to approach it is to sort of start off really maybe even narrow or specific, decisive even. But I don't want to stay there. I'd rather end up more in the possibility space. So as I'm thinking about language, I'm thinking very much about it being a method of communication or a kind of system of communication. But as I'm thinking more about how to think about it in more expansive ways, even more inclusive ways, I'm thinking very much of language having a sort of range of possibilities. So language being something like images, right? Or gestures, or behaviors. Language could be color and shape and texture. And so just really kind of thinking about what are the ways that we might communicate ideas or considerations or curiosities, and very much thinking about even mood or expression being a way to communicate. So very much as I'm trying to kind of think about what that is, trying to think about it in a very expansive way. Definitely curious what Dr. Jones and Izetta have to say about that.
I'll jump in first, unless Isetta wants to jump in first.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I agree with a lot of what Dion said. I would also just thinking as a teacher primarily, it's that unspoken language as well, whether it is like demeanor a kid comes into a classroom with, or thinking about just how my parents would say sometimes it's also how you say it, like that tone that gets conveyed. And that's something I think, especially in the past couple of years, teaching in the pandemic, sometimes teaching via Zoom, paying attention to the cues of body language or a camera being off. Like even that is communicating something, especially like if you have a student who's always very engaging and something, a camera's off, or, so that's a cue for me as a teacher to maybe talk to that student a little bit later. That's language that's conveying things to me that way. So I think it's also important to pay attention to what's not being said, what's being shown, and also how things are being said.
I agree with all of that. And I think one of the things that you brought up, Dion, that sits with me is the use of like visuals when it comes to communication. So as an intervention specialist, I work with a lot of different students who are neurodiverse, right? Who may, young people who have communication delays or challenges and things like that. But even when we talk about getting older, visuals say a lot of things. And there are a lot of different ways to communicate just by having pictures available. And I don't even mean like showing someone a picture of a stop sign and meaning stop. But when you walk into a home or you walk into a certain environment, what does that environment say about the people who are occupying that space, right? Even looking at us right now, right? So the artwork that you have behind you, Dion, the artwork that I have behind me, the shirt that Dr. Jones is wearing, the logo of Nationwide behind John, all of that is communicating something about us, right? Things that are meaningful to us. And that is a way to begin conversations with kiddos and with community members. How you look communicates something, right? And it also means that people are processing and understanding something about you. Having images of children who look like themselves around them, that is also communication. And I don't know that the visual aspect is one that we talk about a lot. I'm not going to speak to y'all's household, but I grew up in a household that was very much don't walk out this door looking like ain't nobody raised you, right? Because the visual was to say something, right? But what about the environments that we set for folks? What about when we are inviting them into these spaces? And as teachers, our names are on the door, but are they our spaces, or are they spaces that belong to children, to the kids that we actually teach and work with? So how do you communicate what you believe about your kids by how you set up your space in your environment?
I love that, Isetta, and I'm thinking so much. So there's two things I'd like to speak to accessibility in a minute, but just on your last point, I think so much about that being in an arts center, in a space that very much functions similar to a museum, and this idea of how is the space constructed, and what is that communicating? Is that communicating that sense of belonging that Sidier spoke to earlier? I'm thinking so much about how that can relay something similar to what Dr. Jones was saying about the nonverbal, the unspoken. What is the way a context or a space or an environment is communicating that someone is welcome here, that someone can be here, that someone is safer here. what are those spaces doing? And I'm also thinking about the visual because I work in the arts and work in education in the arts, often working with media and working with objects that are in the gallery. And you began to name the visual, right? For instance, we shouldn't take for granted that there are possibly people that are experiencing this conversation in very different ways. And we might want to say that as panelists, we are all wearing glasses. And that Dr. Jones and myself are wearing black sweaters. Dr. Jones is wearing a very cool Warrior Scholar black sweatshirt. Mine does not have any such language on it, but I'm inspired by that Warrior Scholar language on the front of Dr. Jones's sweatshirt. That our host, John Jackson, is wearing what looks like maybe a navy blue or a slate gray blazer with a pale blue button-down shirt, and that the nationwide symbol or insignia, nationwide, is on your side, is behind him. Both Izetta and I have paintings behind us, directly behind us. Izetta is wearing a V-neck, white, maybe winter white, cream sweater, and that is communicating something, right? And that already begins to maybe open up the space in a really different way to be able to think about who is able to join us fully, right? Like, how are we thinking about who is able to join us, who has accessibility or access to this conversation, just by describing the visuals that are in the space, describing us as people, as humans in the space. I think that's a really important consideration that I hope that we can even get into a little bit more as we talk.
Now, I have to say this. Okay, Izetta, you triggered something in my mind, and I'm going to bring up some old school movie, okay? Because when you started talking about visuals that were up on the wall and how does that make you feel, my immediate response was to the movie Do the Right Thing. And I will never, ever, ever forget the quote where he walked up into the pizza shop and he said, "Sal, why aren't there any brothers up on the wall?"
Right.
Okay. And that was really, I think I was probably 14 or 15 at that time. And that was the first time I had seen in film somebody that looked my age asking the same question that I always pondered. And it felt so right to say, where is my representation? I never saw myself other than in Black Enterprise, never saw myself other than in Jet Magazine and in Ebony. And so when he said that to Sal, I thought he just described me. He just validated me in that time and in that space. And so I don't know if you guys had similar experiences about a movie where you saw that there wasn't representation or whatnot, but that just brought back just great memories, you know, for me. And so what I'm going to do is use that to transition into the next correlative question, which is, why is language important to communication, and how is it used by people to either include those that they want to include or exclude the people that they want to exclude? And to me, that's really an important component, because until I got older, the only communication in my house was from my mother's perspective, who was an elementary ed teacher, was the King's English when it came to school, the King James Version of the Bible when I was in Sunday school, and what I described as the look when she wanted me to do something or not do something. So those were my contributions to kind of how I grew up thinking about language. So let's start with you, Izetta, in terms of how do you see people who use language to specifically try to include people, and to the extent you also see them exclude people?
I mean, you know, language is constantly evolving, right? And so anytime that someone is sharing a space with another person, that language is being used, right? Be it body language, be it verbal language, any ways of non-verbal communication, it's there. There are certain phrases that especially people of color and Black folks specifically, we have come to learn either mean we are included in the conversation in space, or we are being asked why we are here, right? Or we might be doing the asking because, you know, it is very, the culture would say, who all gonna be over there, right? Because I gotta figure out who's over there. And that means a number of things. And I'm gonna just speak for Isaac and Nicole Thomas, right? If I'm asking you who all gonna be there, who are there gonna be folks like me there? Are there gonna be other Black folks there? Are there gonna be other women there? Is this a space of educators? Is this a space of, you know, people, what age range is it? Am I going to be the only gay person in the mix? Am I going to be, you know, what's going on there, right? And then as a person of color, specifically as a Black woman, then I know how to govern myself, meaning how do I keep myself safe in this space? Is this a space that I want to be in? You know what I mean? Is it a space that I'm going to find myself having to defend myself in? Is it a space where I'm going to find myself having to defend other people being in that space? Is it an inclusive space? Are we talking about the barbecue? Like, is this a space where I can enter and just be completely fully me? Yep. All of the language, Kings, English, Mama and M's, down south, English, whatever I want to, you know what I'm saying? Is it that kind of space? And I think that specifically as people of color and Black folks, we know that language. We know that when we walk into a room, be it we are the only person who looks like us or not, and someone asks, oh, what do you do? Right? What does that actually mean? In some cases, it means, how do you fit in here? Where do you get off being here in this space with me? You know what I mean? And so then I think as adults who are in service positions where we serve the community, and some of those community are youth and young people, then how do we speak to them? What are the things that we are saying that are either consciously or unconsciously inclusive or excluding, right? Because folks be quick in 2022 to be like, oh, that's some millennial stuff. Well, listen, as an elder millennial, I don't know that I like that, right? Or you got the folks with the okay boomer. We know what those things mean, right? So how are we unconsciously inviting people into the space or telling them that they're not actually supposed to be there? So that's the thing that I see. Like it begins as soon as two people are sharing a space together.
Who else wants to take that?
I'll jump in. I don't know why. I'll jump in. I agree with what Isaiah was talking about. I think thinking about how language is used, especially in the classroom from a teacher perspective, as far as including students, I think sometimes we just need to be careful. And I myself try to be careful of like, okay, letting the kids be authentic when we're trying to have discussions, when we're trying to talk about things as far as, okay, a lot of times a student will know what they're talking about. They'll have an answer. They'll have a great insight. They may not say it the way that I would say it as a maybe college educated person or English teacher or whatever lens I'm putting on, if I'm putting on the South Louisiana lens. But they have the answer. And so not trying to exclude them, not trying to jump so quick to be like, well, say it this way, as opposed to, all right, let's meet them where they are. Let's get their authentic language. We can work on, obviously, if we're writing essays or if we're practicing for potential interviews about like how to, go into a different space where, like as Isaiah said, like you're going to be questioned in spaces even before you open your mouth. Like your language sometimes is communicated just by your skin before someone sees, like your name on a resume or sees you. They see your name on a resume, and that communicates things. And so they're going to make these assumptions. They still make these assumptions, but still there is something to letting students be authentic, letting them have their voice, helping them not only like find that voice, use that voice, but also helping them understand like, hey, there are places where unfortunately, people are going to judge you, and you're going to enter these different and difficult spaces. And how do you protect yourself? How do you use the best language to protect yourself? But also still be authentic?
Yeah, you make such an important point, Dr. Jones, this idea of protecting oneself in a space that might be full of daggers, and how one might know that space is that. Like if we're thinking about language as a system, we can begin to think about the immense systems that we have in our society, and those systems being full of inequities, right? We can begin to think about language as having a hierarchy in ways, and being presented in this hierarchy, like a hierarchy for folks. And so folks are like, I don't speak that way, actually. My accent is this way. This is how I say this particular word. Or I do need to pause for a moment to respond because of maybe a developmental delay, or maybe because the processing in the mind needs a little bit more space to determine how to respond or to just take in what's being communicated. And so this idea about how can language connect us, I think language is important because I think it can connect us. And I think if we're thinking about it in expansive ways, thinking about it with possibility, we can think about what are all the ways that it can connect us. And I'd like to also think about what are the ways that language can be something that causes less harm. Because I do think that language has had a history, any system, right, that is in our society, and the way our society is constructed, is there's harm in the way that these systems have been constructed. And so how do we begin to exercise language and all the possibilities of language to do less harm?
Now, you guys are just triggering me. Okay, so I'm going to keep sharing my triggers. Because this one's a confession. Okay. So naturally, I told you earlier about how my mother's philosophy was about language, and her mindset was she grew up in Tennessee, and her father was the NAACP president in the Oak Ridge, Knoxville area for a number of years. Okay, and so they lived through some of the harshest moments, from the South perspective. And so she was very, what I will call military in nature, in terms of the importance of mastering the English language. Okay, and then I had the privilege, okay, if you want to call it the privilege, of going to law school and started practicing as an attorney. And so naturally, language is our currency, whether it's language in terms of the spoken word or whether it's undocumented word. And so being crisp in language just went to another ethosphere for me. And so here's where my confession comes. What I had found myself doing from a good spirit of wanting to help young people, people of color, people who come from impoverished areas, that I've had what I would consider and what I've justified in my mind is a coaching mindset of, hey, I recognize that you're not speaking in the way that I was taught, or I'm recognizing that you're communicating in a way that may put you at a disadvantage in your future. And what I didn't really grasp until listening to you guys speak is I'd never really practiced the patience that I think educators have and that they need to have to be able to meet students where they are and to have the patience to help them where they're at and to be able to talk to them in a way that allows them to become more learned and to practice and be better. But my angle almost came from a punitive perspective in the way that I would communicate it. And I have to now acknowledge that that's what my behavior was, and that I need to do a better job of doing exactly what you said, Dr. Jones, which is to acknowledge that these young people are where they are for a multitude of different reasons. And the goal is not to give them an A, B, C, D, or E, or F based upon how we see things as adults, but to just assess them and then figure out, how do I bring you along? So, if you guys could talk a little bit about, the empathy and the patience and what it is that you guys have to do with students to really be helpful, because to me, how you interact with them and how you bring them along is either teaching them inclusion or exclusion. And my concern is some of my tactics or my lack of patience may have been more earmarked and received by them as exclusion, not necessarily inclusion.
Well, John, you're not alone. I would say the educational system in America hasn't had that patience for a long time. And I hope, maybe I'm being an optimist, that maybe we're kind of turning the page on that a little bit. I think one thing is we need to always recognize that, like, kids are brilliant. If you think about the language that we use just in America, the language you see in commercials and pop culture, who invents that? That's young people, right? Slang means your language is alive, and that means your language is changing. That means your people are alive. And that is driven by the youth. They determine when things are cool, and when things aren't cool, like, by the time your old white grandmother uses fleek, it's dead. So just acknowledging, like, their genius, I think, is part of it, in, like, the way they use the language, the way they put things together. And I hope we're starting to get to that point now where that acknowledgement is being more inclusive to the intelligence and the creativity that students have. I think it's also important to, get them to understand each other's different language and how different people communicate. I think that helps build empathy in that regard. The fact that, you may talk to someone else from a different region of the country, they'll have a different dialect. Doesn't mean they're less intelligent. That's just how they talk. I think, having those conversations and getting them exposure to that, whether that is through communication directly, through literature, builds that empathy. And I think that's probably one of the most important things we can do.
There's an interesting comment or a question in the chat that talks about language as it plays into respectability politics. And we all know that, right? This idea of code shifting, this idea of performing, this, performative gestures, performative ways of speaking, inflection, trying to speak more like a particular sort of way. I think when Dr. Jones says that, what he said about education, I think is so true. And I think that there's been a narrow way of presenting language to learners, and saying this is the way. And that's been based on sort of superiority, right? This idea that a particular culture is superior over other cultures, a particular way of speaking is superior over other ways of speaking, and has not been so so quick to allow for other ways of being in the world, other ways of knowing, other ways of understanding, other ways of communicating or connecting. I think we miss out on so much of human connection when we are not open to allowing for people to communicate the best way that they know how to. And that includes sometimes behaviors. Having enough patience to be able to understand that a behavior is always communicating something. It's not, a behavior is just not in and of itself. I mean, we see this in, when we're thinking about accommodations and accessibility and really having interactions with people with disabilities, this idea of that the behavior is just a behavior and it stands alone. No, behavior is always communicating something. But then that also goes, we can think of it in expansive ways too, is what is the expectation for language and how can that expectation begin to shut down and exclude and empty out a room, right? You want to know who's in that space. Will there be people that that will not harm me? Will there be people where I can feel included? Will there be, or is that space expecting me to bend and shape into something so that I might be included? Is that space wanting me to speak in a particular kind of way? Is that space wanting me to lead with my degrees? Wanting me to lead with a particular kind of inflection, wanting me to lead in a certain way. And in some ways, we are all quite practiced at it, right? There's an awareness that we have when we are in and out of the shifting, when we are in and out of, it's just so embedded in us. But that doesn't take away the fact that we might be able to create spaces where people can show up as they are and not have to bend themselves into the expectation of, here's what I expect from you. Here's how I expect you to speak. Here's how I expect you to perform towards a superior culture or superior ideals.
That all reminds me of a quote from Bell Hooks. And she says that the purpose of education is not to dominate or prepare our students to be dominators, but rather to create the conditions for freedom. Language is a key component to freedom. If it weren't, then when as Black folks, Black Americans, when our ancestors were taken from their motherland and brought here to North America and specifically to these United States, right? They would not, the oppressors would not have coordinated such amazing tactics to keep people from being able to communicate with one another, taking folks who speak several different languages from several different tribes and mixing them and putting them together, because if they were allowed to communicate, they was going to get free, right? So as educators, there's one thing to be caring, it is one thing to be empathetic, but if you are a caring, empathetic educator who is not tackling your biases, these kids ain't gonna get free because we're not going to allow them to be, right? My family, a lot of our ancestors, if you are in your late 30s, early 40s, 50s and beyond, we grew up with folks who taught us this is the way that you speak in this space, and this is how you conduct yourself in this house. And we might talk like this up in here, but when you get out of this door, it's different. Why? That wasn't for freedom's sake, that was for survival, right? We are past that point. We have to get past that point where young folks can do more than survive, but they can thrive and be free. And in doing that, we have to celebrate whatever your mother tongue is, whatever that home language is. In my home with a young mother, my mother was 19 when she had me. I had a young mother, I had a young great-grandmother, but I had my great-grandmother. We were allowed to use all of our language, except for ain't. You couldn't say ain't, you couldn't say lie. Oh my goodness, you better say a story or a fib. Okay. That was it, right? But other than that, we could pretty much say what we wanted to say and express ourselves. But we also were taught that's not how the world is, though. So when you leave this place, govern yourself accordingly. What I love about these young folks, and I'm at a point in my life where I can start calling folks young folks, okay, see the grace, is that they're not about that life, right? They are going to be authentically themselves in all spaces. And how free is that? How glorious is that? So those of us, though, who are raised in survival mode, how do we celebrate this? It's more than just being empathetic. It is work. It is work to do with our internal selves. And that is the amazing thing about language. It changes and it evolves and it grows. And if it does not, it dies. It dies. We have got to do the work to stop killing the freedom of these young folks. And part of that is language. And there's always going to be this ebb and flow, at least here in America, because I personally do not see a time in which there will not be a dominant, privileged society in America, right? But challenging it by celebrating and being authentically who you are is amazing. And to do that as an educator, right? Because I'm gonna use all my ain'ts, and I'm gonna cut off the endings of words. I'm gonna use my home language. I'm gonna use them degree languages, you know, them the papers I'm paying for. Okay, thank you, OSU. Also, Navient and whoever else is taking my loans after the end of this month. But you know, all of that, allowing folks to just truly be and getting away from a mode of survival in a system, but breaking the system down, which is hard when the system, you're a person who is constantly being broken by the system. But that's a thing to do as educators. It's work. It is some hard work to do, but what is language without that? You know, what is freedom going to be without that, without the evolution of language?
I appreciate your point about moving from surviving a system into having more agency in the way that you navigate systems, and how we can, in the spaces that we're in, particularly these learning spaces, how we can cultivate that in young people. I think so much about how it's discouraged when young people ask questions as if they're talking back, or there were a few comments in the chat about how are we preparing young people? Are we preparing them to be dominated? Are we preparing them to be to have someone sort of over them, or to have them always be subservient to something or someone? Or are we preparing them for freedom? I really do love that notion of how do we, particularly those of us who are in learning spaces, how do we cultivate that? I think there is something to checking our biases and being able to understand that we all have them, but being self-aware enough to continually check in about bias and biases, because many of us have multiple, right? And they're intersecting, just as we as a people have intersections in how we are showing up in the world. And so that requires us to have difficult conversations with ourselves, to sometimes listen before chastising, before maybe not even chastising at all, right? Before assuming, right? Allow someone to show up in the space as themselves. Do not assume. I know that there's so many spaces that I show up and there is an assumption about who I am, what I know or what I do not know. I don't even have a chance in some of these spaces, right? You don't get to show up, and how might we, those of us that are in learning spaces or in and around learning spaces, but then in any space, allow for people to seek a kind of freedom. And what does that mean? this idea of cultivating a space where one can be free, where one can feel liberated, not feel swallowed up whole by oppressive systems.
So you guys have me, oh, go ahead, Dr. Jones.
Just a quick follow-up, because I think Deanne was speaking to something. I saw someone had put something in the chat about how teachers, I think, deal with like students and using language in the classroom and discussion. It's very scary for teachers to give up control. But I think it's kind of a necessary thing, especially like if you're trying to encourage students to have their authentic voice and use that voice, and also get them to recognize their own genius. You have to take a step back and, let them, as much as you can, lead the discussion. Let them like present their ideas. Let them talk about what they see, what they think, what they feel. And it's scary. It's a very scary thing because you don't know where it's going to go. But I think it's important to allow that classroom to be a space where they have that freedom, because we know they might not have that freedom many places outside of the classroom. So give them that space. And I think that space is like maybe practice or training for them to, strengthen that voice so they can take it with them, when they leave the classroom.
Well, I'm going to give you guys my confession number 2.
Are you Usher?
Usher playing in the background.
Basically.
So as you guys are sitting there talking about freedom, okay, part of the freedom is what is the vision that you're creating, okay, and we're here as 4 African Americans on the panel from the perspective of historically Black people, okay, and so I started thinking about a phrase that I'm sure at various point in times we've either said it ourselves or we've certainly heard other people say it. And I just said it probably 2 days ago, okay? When I was watching something on TikTok or on Instagram or something along those lines. And I said, well, there's another thing that Black folks don't do. And it was because my space of what I grew up in was limited in terms of what Black people thought was acceptable for us to do. And the context was, I had a friend of mine who got exposed to a higher end resort that was all about relaxation, trying to help you identify certain experiences that you've never had before. And so he was going down through this list, and I was just like, I've never heard of any Black folks that have ever done that kind of stuff, and so we started having a dialogue around things that Black folks tend to not think that other Black folks do. And skiing was one of the first ones that popped up. And so what that prompted as a part of this conversation, as it relates to school and school environment and school resources and what is the freedom to express yourself, is I did a comparison in my mind about my experience to my brother's, okay? My experience coming through middle school and high school is I was an athlete, played football and basketball and ran track. I was a DJ that listened to hip hop and R&B music. And so Black folks kind of accepted me whole cloth, okay? You compare my brother, who's just 3 years younger than me. My brother was into skateboarding. My brother was not into hip hop. He was wanting to listen to YouTube and Red Hot Chili Peppers and all this other stuff. He still to this day will be watching the NCAA championship game or the Super Bowl, and he'll be off to the side reading a book. And he's a drawer. He's a phenomenal artist. And so I could clearly see when we were in middle school and in high school that his ability to express himself was not as well received within what I would call the Black community that was in the school. And so for those that are involved in the teaching and environments where you're around students, it would be interesting to see how do you have to, counteract some of those, what I would call negative influences, that if you do have young people who have a different passion than the traditional passion, how do you validate them? How do you enable them to show up in their best self And how do you go about trying to have the larger dialogue, which is everybody is varied in terms of their skills and how they choose to communicate their authentic self.
That's the harm that that's been done by a particular culture having dominating other cultures, saying that this is superior over other cultures, because it has caused harm for everyone, really. It's caused everyone to be seeking to be this particular kind of superior. This is how you know I'm smart. This is how you know I'm cultured. This is how you know I'm traveled. This is how you know I know a thing. This is how you know I'm great. And that's been harmful for everyone, is having a very narrow sense of what it means to be. And it's interesting because in the arts environment, that I have that experience is not diverse at all. I mean, you know, it's limited. It's limited. It's, I think there's some awareness. There's people trying to figure it out. But this has been very recent, this trying to figure it out. It is not a space that I have felt over the years of being. I've been working in the arts for over 2 decades, and still do not feel included in that space in many different, you know, I could be on a meeting and there's an assumption that folks have about kind of what I might be doing in that. Like, what are you doing in this meeting? Like, why are you here? When they sort of look at the, and I know that there are learners and that there are students that we are working with. We're located at the university, at Ohio State University, the arts center that I work at. And it is important to acknowledge that we all can show up in the space very differently. But what's important is to allow for folks to see that you're going to protect that space so that people can show up as they are. I've been in situations where there's maybe been a particular kind, maybe identity in the room, and someone has shown up with that identity plus some other identities, and really had to do a work of saying everybody's welcome here, all of your interests, all of your, you know, all of your ways of showing up in the world, all of your ways of being, all of your ways of knowing, and allowing for that to exist. And I think that that's tough. I'd love to hear from Dr. Jones and Izetta about how one does that in the classroom, because I'm in a public space and I'm always thinking about how to be more public in a public space. What do we need to be doing to exercise our publicness, right? How does one know that they can be in this public space as they are? Because there's so many different messages about this is how you need to show up to be in this particular space. And I think that happens in the classroom too. And that also happens in cultural segments. What has happened is that your proximity to what is thought of as superior or dominant has forced folks to behave in ways to get in proximity or closer to what is seen as accepted or what is seen as dominant or superior. And that has been incredibly harmful for everyone, including people who think that they are a part of a particular superior culture. It's been harmful for everyone. And so what do we need to be doing? I think this is an interesting question. What do we need to be doing to make sure that there is inclusion and belonging in the room, and how that might mean we need to say something or step in or be quiet? and how sometimes that might mean that we have to stop whatever's happening and make sure folks know this is what's happening in this space. And I encourage you to take what is happening in this space in terms of inclusion and to move that out into wider spaces. We are global communities. We are many kinds of people. And so how can people begin to show up and not be seen less than because maybe you speak multiple languages, or maybe you your way of being in the world is different, or your way of expressing is different. And it is a work that is an active work. You don't get to do one thing and then all of a sudden this becomes an inclusive space, or this becomes something that, oh, you belong here because you've done a few things, or you've made a statement, or you've said these things. We want you to be here. We want you to feel welcome here. It's really active and engaged, and it's exhausting work. And I'd like to think that if you're probably not exhausted doing this work of inclusion and thinking about, then maybe you're not doing the work. So interested to hear what Izetta and Dr. Jones think about that, particularly in classroom settings.
Great,
Dr. Jones, I was gonna say, my position has been out of the classroom more than it has in the past few years. So I'm gonna give that to you.
All right. Well, do you want me to mention the elephant in the room that's been happening throughout this country the past couple of years? I mean, we are in a fight for our educational lives with including diverse voices in the curriculum, in the literature, in how we teach history. There are people who are trying to control the narrative, which I think speaks to your original point, John. There are people who want to control the narrative that say all Black people are one way. And that's even influencing how Black people think, oh, we all have to be this. We all have to like dress a certain way, or gotta wear Jordans, or we gotta do whatever. And we know that's not the truth. We know we are not a monolithic people. And I think one way we try to show that is through diversity of many types in literature, that we allow kids to see themselves in the books, in characters. You might see yourself as a character who may not even be Black, but they have similar characteristics, or you share similar interests. You're like, well, I like that too. You might see yourself in a poem or in a piece of art. But we can't not fight against this wave, I think, that wants us to water down curriculum, water down history, whitewash history, eliminate voices, eliminate perspectives, eliminate all the variety of what people are, to say there's just one monolithic American person, where we know, as I like to say, it's a gumbo, not a melting pot, right? Because I'm from Louisiana, it's always a gumbo. So, I mean, I think it's a fight, and I agree with you. It's very exhausting work. It's a fight against a very, I don't know what to say politely, very interesting movement that's happening right now, that a lot of us, we know better. And it's on us to be brave enough to expose students to the variety of who people are, who they are, and also allowing them to tell their own narratives, allowing them to say who they are, to write about who they are, to show who they are, and be proud of that.
So let me ask this, Dr. Jones, because just for the benefit of people in the group, because you started to talk upon something that's really important, which is the curriculum aspect. I personally don't know how curriculum is established by a school district. Okay, I don't know if that's determined by the Board of Education. I don't know if that's determined by the superintendent with a committee. I don't know to what extent teachers are given independent flexibility to supplement things that they think are important for their individual class. So if you could just, to whatever level of knowledge that you have, if you could just share that, because here's one of the lenses that I had is when you see people, a lot of parents recently talking about they ought to have a right to have some influence on what it is that their kids are being taught. And I will say, coming from probably the more conservative side. But my initial reaction at that point is like, well, Black families have been asking, that we don't want certain things taught to our kids for the last 50 years, and that's fallen on deaf ears as a matter of practice. And so I would think for this, those of us that want to be, if you want to say, more strategic in how we could be helpful to curriculum kind of development, I think step number one is for us to know, how does that even come about?
Sure, Isaiah, feel free to jump in with this too. I know you definitely have some expertise about this as well. But I mean, state boards of education primarily do a lot to set the tone of what curriculum gets handed down and filtered down through individual school boards and then to teachers. I like to think, and maybe because I'm just a rebel, that there is some creativity that teachers have within, okay, this is what the state wants. These are the standards. These are the things that, kids, the state says kids have to know to graduate, to pass whatever test. Mind you, the test doesn't necessarily mean you're intelligent or not. You just have to pass the test to graduate. These are the standards. This is what you have to teach. So I would like to think as a teacher, and not everyone feels that way. Sometimes we feel as though our creativity has been taken away, or our voices sometimes we may not have as strong of voices as we do. But I think there's ways to creatively, get at some of those standards and also allow students to see themselves in the curriculum that you are trying to get at. The standard may say, okay, you have to teach about the Declaration of Independence, for instance, or the Founding Fathers. Fine, talk about who the Founding Fathers are, but I'll talk about who they really are as well. This is where the controversy is, right? Yeah, hey, John, I'll give you a confession. That's we're confessing things. When I was in third grade, my favorite president, third grade, was Thomas Jefferson. Before I knew better, right? I was like, oh, he wrote some cool things. It sounded cool, right? And no one taught me differently until years later. I'm like, oh yeah, that dude. Yeah, nah, not really, not my favorite, right? I still respect his ideas, but he didn't put any of that into practice. And it's fair to tell students the whole story, right? Give them the whole story about who these people really are, and where you're living, and what America really is. That doesn't mean you're an American. I don't think. I think the most patriotic thing you can do is to challenge your country to be better. All right, and I think there's room in the curriculum to do that. It may be that we sometimes as educators need to push each other, empower each other, encourage each other, support each other in doing that. But yeah, we don't create our own curriculum, but I think we have some creativity as far as how we deliver it. And I think we definitely have a responsibility to encourage students and help them see themselves in that curriculum.
So I have so many thoughts. But one of the things that we've talked a lot about is the ownership of educators in these to create and sustain these safer spaces, to supplement the curriculums that are selected in a number of different ways, right? And I've been in a lot of different rooms when it comes to curriculum. I have most recently worked with our Ohio Board of Education on revising standards for the early learning standards for our youngest of kiddos from birth to age 6, right? Then there is being on the curriculum selection teams with your school district. And specifically for our school district in Columbus, there is conversation and agreement between the administration and the union on having teachers be a part of that selection. And again, it comes to the teachers, right? We help select, we help revise, we help supplement, we do this, we do that. But we are also in the same system that we are fighting against. And so who is taking ownership of making our educators safe enough to be vulnerable in these spaces, to be able to create safe spaces and sustain them? I am a fat Black bi woman, right? And most people know me as teaching our youngest kids. our preschoolers. So some people would think, well, what's she doing up in here? Right? Like you teach preschool. Oh, you had to have a master's degree for that? And then we get past all that language, right? Do I belong in this space? And then there is showing up as my authentic self in my space. Do I feel safe enough in my classroom or my office, wherever I do my educating, to have a painting like this on the wall, to have a picture of myself and my wife on my table, like all of my other colleagues do, right? But someone could challenge that. Is the environment that I am in helping to sustain me, to keep me safe so that I can do this very hard, very vulnerable work to create and sustain these spaces for my kids? If you have teachers who cannot fully show up, then how are they going to allow their kids to show up? Confession, in 2012, I worked in, and a lot of us have, a lot of Black teachers, a lot of BIPOC educators still work in buildings where there are few of us, where the majority of the staff, especially the educators, and this may very well be true for you too, Dion, and maybe for you, John, as well, are white. I'm not even just gonna say not Black, they white, right? I was in a building where I was one of 3 or 4 Black teachers, and I'm not even talking about our amazing support professionals like our custodians and our bus drivers and our food service workers. I'm talking about the teachers. And I showed up to work on this day in 2012 in a hoodie and a fro bigger than the one I came here with. And I was asked by another teacher, were we going to be okay today? Were there going to be any problems today? It was the day after Trayvon Martin was slain. But I also still had the job to create and sustain a safe, welcoming, full representative classroom for my 8 babies who are on IEPs, who 6 out of the 8 were Black boys, the other 2 Mexican boys. How do I do that? How do we do that, right? We have this grave responsibility to be all of these things for our babies, and we often cannot be all of ourselves in these same spaces, right? And we got to use the tools that we are given by the administrators, by the state, by all of these things to do it. Do the tools, do the master's tools dismantle the master's house? Audre Lorde said they don't, right? How do I do it? How do I break down the walls and dodge the cinder blocks? How do I do that? Right? How do I show up? We were taught that we were a monolith because that is what the oppressors wanted us to believe. Again, going back to language and going back to freedom. So then as we progress, it shows up in different ways that this is the way of being Black, because well, it was told that we were. And then when we surpassed that, we broke down molds, then it had to shift another way, right? And nobody wanted to talk about where all of these other things came from, right? How we owned and created country music and rock and roll. And it wouldn't be no Michael Bublé scatting if it wasn't for Little Richard doing it first. And all of these different things. And the same to say for all of our new American babies and folks who reside and are being brought up in the education system, right? Not celebrating and acknowledging all of these different cultures. But when you can't celebrate and acknowledge yours, and you got the same dominant folks telling you how you can do it and how to show up, again, there's a lot to do. And so then we move into where we are now, right? Which is happening globally because of the pandemic, but also because the pandemic shed a lot of light on things. But we have the era of the Great Resignation, where people are leaving jobs, where people are leaving teaching jobs because they're not safe. Physically, a lot of spaces are not safe, but how long have they been emotionally safe? How many of your Black and brown teachers have been in spaces where they can't completely show up for their students because they can't completely show up without being hurt themselves, right? But how many people are talking about that? I don't think enough. And I think it's hard for us, those of us who have gone through it, who continue to grow through it, to be vulnerable enough to say it, because we got to go back to it, right? Like, we all got to go back to work after this. We all still have to try to create these open and vulnerable spaces for babies after this, while still dealing with the things that we are constantly dealing with. We're still trying to be better people and fight, right? Because we still aren't welcome in some spaces, even the spaces who employ us.
That right there, we are still not welcome in some places, including so many of us working in spaces that do not include us, but employ us. And I think that right there is such, I think about that a lot, wanting to be a part of enduring transformative practices in a system, in a space, in an organization, in institutions, but also being inside of the institution and having enough self-awareness to know that while I have an institutional critique, I am also inside the institution. And what does that work look like on a daily basis? And it's not for the faint of heart, and it's not for everyone. Everyone doesn't want to change the system and be inside of the system it's trying to change. And I do think people are making some different choices, but I also think people are also standing still and saying, I'm not going anywhere until this system changes. I'm going to do this work as long as I can to be able to move this forward, to be able to transform spaces. But it's a difficult work, particularly when folks are not only just asking you, why are you here in the first place? But also, why are you trying to change this place?
And the conversations, right? Like, again, going back to early childhood, one of the things that I committed myself to a few years ago is shedding light on gender roles in early childhood education, and specifically starting to promote and create that representation for our younger folks who are non-binary and trans, and who are coming from families who have non-binary spouses and trans parents and gay parents and things like that. And folks don't want to talk about that with the little people, right? Because for some reason, a lot of folks think that gender expression and identity and sexuality begin at age 13, but that ain't true, right? But then how do I do that? How can I do that in spaces where I can't fully show up, where I might have to question the photo of us on my desk and how that's going to be taken? Or, you know, does it look like I'm promoting some kind of agenda because I also identify as a member of the LGBTQ community? So of course, I'm going to be coming with the agenda that don't just include brunch on it to shove into people's faces and turn out the baby's gay. You know what I mean? And people are afraid. Like, folks are afraid to do this work because they're afraid of their own longevity. Like, in the system, like, can I keep my job and do this? Can I stay alive? literally and do this, because as progressive as we may seem in Ohio and in the city of Columbus, we are not. Folks can still be fired in Ohio for being gay, right? Folks can still be turned away from medical professionals for being gay, right? And then here I am, like a gay Black woman. Well, you want to triple threat it or not? Like, how dare you? How dare you even bring up a conversation like this, right? And when you choose to do the work, what do you really choose, right? For those of us who have chosen to do this work, did I fully know what I was getting myself into, right? The vulnerability, the this, the that. It's so much, it's so necessary. It is so necessary to be a revolutionary, to help evolve this place, to truly be like Whitney and believe that all these children are the future. You know what I'm saying? to really do it. It's heavy. But it's more than just having the right books on a bookshelf. You know, and if you can't be your whole self, how can you have all those books on the bookshelf? Right? Like, when do you get to see you? When do you, as a Black educator, get to see yourself? Or are you constantly creating the mirror that you get to look into? You know, where's your reflection? Where's your sliding glass door? Where's your open window? Where's your this? Right? And in the 90s, folks tried it. You know, they tried it in the name of hip hop. Oh, we got to get these Black kids to understand how amazing William Shakespeare was as a rapper. So it's going to be a million Romeo and Juliet hip hop style. You know, that was the 90s and in the early 2000s and stuff like that. Was representation then, but we know more now. We know differently. And we may know more and we may know to do differently, but has the world truly changed enough for us to be able to change it? Right? And these are just questions that Izetta asked herself in the middle of the night. Don't be like me and stay up until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning pondering. But it's just, you know, when you're in this work, to do this work, it's the things that you can't help but to think about and to acknowledge. And I'm grateful to be able to acknowledge it out loud in a space where I feel safe enough to do that, you know.
Amen. Let me trigger this real quick. We have about 5 minutes left. And so I wanted to ask Lorez, with the 5 minutes that we do have, are there any key questions that you've received either in the chat or through Facebook feed that you would like the panelists to address?
Thanks, John. First, I will say just amazing points are being raised. If you haven't had a chance, panelists, to take a look at the chat to see the love from Facebook and just in the Zoom room right now, please check it out. I'm going to shift it back to the curriculum question from a question that was raised a while ago from one of our guests. One topic I'm very interested in is shifting our educational framework from discipline, rule following, or creating good workers to a more proactive framework of using school to foster critical thinkers, creators, leaders, to ask questions and to really engage in that learning. How can language play into this shift in the educational framework and specifically in the ELA space?
You want me to take that? There's somewhere everyone's quiet.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I teach high school. I just only teach one class. In the past, I've taught more than one class. I am a big fan, big proponent of getting kids, encouraging kids to take deeper looks at literature from different perspectives. I'm a big proponent of encouraging them to disagree with what I might see or what popular critics might see. Like, confession, I have used critical race theory as literary theory in my class, and no kids were harmed. We've looked at books from a feminist lens. We've looked at it from intersectional lenses. This idea that there is only one way to read a book, only one way to analyze a book is ridiculous, and it's antiquated, and it just produces an educational slave mentality, basically. There is room to be able to dive into discourse and see things differently and debate and have productive discussion. And there's a freedom to doing that. Again, it is very scary. It is to some people very dangerous, but I think it's very necessary. I think I don't know. I don't have an answer for how to encourage more people to do that, other than I'm an instructional coach now, so I try to work with the teachers I have and try to give them different ways of approaching lessons and allowing students to express their voice and find their voice and see themselves. And something I think, Izetta, I was thinking about as you were saying a lot of great things. It's okay as an educator to say, I don't get it or I don't understand. It's not okay to stay in that place of not understanding, right? It's like, I may not know, I don't know a lot of things. And talk to people, ask people, do your own research, right? Communicate, but don't just stay in that place of ignorance. And listen to your students. Like if a student tells you their pronouns, listen to their pronouns, use their pronouns. If they want to be called this name, they're identifying a certain way, don't be that person to say, well, I'm gonna call you this. I mean, that's wrong on so many levels. And the one thing you're definitely not doing is building a relationship, and you're not going to get any sort of connection, any sort of learning without that relationship in the first place. I don't know if they answered the question or not.
I wholeheartedly listen to students, listen to young people, listen to how people want to be identified and accepted. It is not, it's not up to anyone to say, I don't understand this, I don't get this, you might not understand it, you might not get it. If someone is telling you who they are in the world, believe them. Yeah. And that goes for a lot of different things. But when folks are telling you how they're showing up in a space, how they're showing up in the world, you believe them, you accept that. It's not your job to challenge that. It's not that's where we can listen. Like was said earlier, that's where we can do our best listening. It's interesting being in a museum, in museum education, because I've been in the classroom. I taught in the classroom for a short period of time, and I was told really specifically by the leadership in the school that I was in that arts integration didn't have a place in this environment. We needed to focus really, so there was just a really specific focus on how we needed to be teaching, and I knew then that that space wasn't going to include me. I'm an artist, and that space just wasn't going to include me. And maybe I could have kept seeking spaces that might have included me, but I found a body of work inside of art spaces. And so what I have the opportunity to do is to partner with educators across learning spaces to think about, back to the question from the chat, to think about how do we develop critical thinking skills? How do we develop creative thinking skills? How do we make room for all of that? And in some ways, it is about being out there in the world. I'm a partner out there in the world, partnering with educators that might be in more traditional or conventional learning spaces, and saying, here are some things to expose learners to expose young people to expose students to. And here is a space just beyond maybe what they might think is a classroom, so that they can consider, oh, learning can also happen here. Learning can happen in front of this film or with this film. Learning can happen in the gallery space. Learning can happen in the theater space, and that all of this is related as well too. It's not my job to make this learner into an artist. That's not the point. The point is to open up dimensions of learning and dimensions of thinking, so that we might think, period. So that we might think. I think we should be careful about assuming that thinking is happening in learning spaces. One must cultivate cultivate the space so that it allows for thinking.
I'm so glad you said that last part, Dion. And John, I just want to take a minute because I know the person that posed the question also said, you know, relating this back to English language arts.
And we got 60 seconds.
I got you. I think I might be able to do it in 30. The books, the literature, but also teach more than trauma, right? There are people love and fell in love with The Hate You Give, right? That book. And it was push. But there are other books as well, right? Black futurism is a thing. Okay, can we get some Legend Born? Can we get some titles like that into the hands of our students when it comes to picture books that are celebratory, right? We weren't just who we were, but we are now, right? And so there are books like by Derek C. Barnes, like Crown and Ode to the Fresh Cut. Whoo! Listen, picking up a picture book about a barbershop experience did my whole heart well, and I'm a whole grown person. So a child being able to see stuff like that. Sulway by Lupita Nyong'o. You know, so many books like that, right? That are celebratory of who we are now and where we are going, because Black futurism is revolutionary in itself, right? Not only did we once exist, not only are we here now, but we're gonna be here, baby, whether you want us or not. So let's show our babies that they're gonna be here. Let's show our young folks that you will live, ooh, and prosper. Ooh, that's how you do that work, and you connect it to the literature and do more than just show who we been and what we did, because we've done more, and those things are great, right? You know, the stoplights and the this and books about Dr. King, right? But Dr. King was so that we could still be here and be, right? And think a Black woman, because without his whole Black wife, we wouldn't even have this whole day to celebrate this man.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna end with that. Thank a Black woman.
Well, all I got to say, y'all, is my. I first have to give honor and say thank you to my wonderful panelists for your participation today. I always consider it a success when I'm in the room, when I'm in a conversation with people that have more knowledge than me, they have more wisdom than me, they have more experience than me. And so to Miss Dion Custer-Edwards, Miss Izetta Thomas, and Dr. Sidney Jones, I must say, well done, my good and faithful servants. I also want to say thank you to all of our outstanding sponsors and all of our supporters, the Columbus City School Partners, our City Year Board members, the staff members, all the AmeriCorps members, and the Columbus Foundation. And we certainly want to give a special shout out to other City Year sites that are joining us from Philadelphia, from Memphis, from Tulsa, from Little Rock, and our city up north to the northeast, Cleveland. And so I also want to just thank everybody who took time today to join us. And my hope for you is that you've gotten a little bit smarter, that you've gotten a little bit wiser, and a little bit more enlightened. And just want to remind you that this session will be available to watch again on our City Year Columbus Facebook page. And we really look forward to continuing this equity work in our future discussions. And so what I would like to do is just close out with another reminder from Dr. Martin Luther King that we all have the power and the authority to change this world if we all have the right mindset. And that's a servant mindset. And his quote is, everybody can be great because everybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You only need a heart full of grace and a soul generated by love. So my hope for each and every one of you today is that you will be encouraged, that you will be blessed, and that you will make the commitment to continue adding value to the lives of young people by having a servant spirit. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.